December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. While the USS Arizona burned and the USS Oklahoma capsized, one critical ship was conspicuously absent from the devastation. The USS Enterprise CV-6 was 200 miles west of Oahu, returning from a mission to Wake Island. Her absence that morning would prove to be one of the most fortunate accidents in American military history. Over the next 4 years, this single aircraft carrier would participate in nearly every major engagement of the Pacific War, survive direct bomb hits that should have sunk her, and earn more battle stars than any other U.S. warship in World War II. The Japanese would report her sunk multiple times. Each time she would return. They called her the Gray Ghost. This is the story of how one ship and her crew changed the course of history. The USS Enterprise was laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding on July 16, 1934, launched in 1936, and commissioned on May 12, 1938. She was the second ship to bear the name Enterprise in U.S. Navy history, and the sixth Yorktown-class carrier, though she and her sister Yorktown were technically the lead ships of the class. At 809 feet long and displacing 19,800-ton standard, she was designed to carry 90 aircraft and could make 32.5 knots at flank speed. But specifications don't capture what made Enterprise special. From the beginning, she was known as a lucky ship. Her crew believed it. Her commanders knew it. And by 1942, the Japanese would fear it. On December 7, 1941, Enterprise was under the command of Vice Admiral William Halsey, Jr., one of the U.S. Navy's most aggressive commanders. The carrier had departed Pearl Harbor on November 28 with Task Force 8, ferrying Marine Fighter Squadron 211 to reinforce Wake Island. The mission had been delayed by heavy weather, and Enterprise was scheduled to return to Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 6th. But the weather delays meant she was still at sea when the Japanese struck. At 6:15 on December 7th, Enterprise launched 18 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 for a routine search ahead of the ship. The aircraft were to land at Ford Island after completing their search pattern. Lieutenant Commander Halstead Hopping was leading one section of scouts when he spotted something that shouldn't have been there. Japanese aircraft heading toward Oahu. He broke radio silence immediately, transmitting a warning that was received with confusion at Pearl Harbor. Minutes later, Hopping's SBD was jumped by Japanese Zero fighters. He and his radio man gunner were shot down and killed, becoming some of the first American casualties of the Pacific War. Other Enterprise aircraft arriving over Oahu found themselves in a desperate fight. Some were shot down by Japanese fighters. Others were fired upon by trigger-happy American anti-aircraft gunners who couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the chaos. 5 Enterprise aircraft were destroyed over Pearl Harbor with multiple casualties. Admiral Halsey, receiving fragmentary reports aboard Enterprise, immediately ordered the task force to search southwest of Pearl for the Japanese carriers. It was a futile hunt. The Japanese strike force was actually northwest of Oahu and already withdrawing. But Halsey's aggressive instinct, his immediate impulse to attack rather than defend, would characterize Enterprise operations for the next 4 years. When Enterprise finally entered Pearl Harbor on the evening of December 8th, her crew witnessed devastation beyond comprehension. Battleship Row was a graveyard of twisted steel. Oil fires still burned on the water. The smell of fuel oil and death hung heavy in the humid air, but Enterprise had escaped untouched. The carrier that would become the most important ship in the Pacific had survived to fight. The first months of the Pacific War were catastrophic for the United States. Wake Island fell on December 23rd, despite desperate resistance. Guam was lost. The Philippines were being overrun. Hong Kong surrendered. Malaya was collapsing. Singapore would fall. The Japanese seemed unstoppable, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet had exactly 3 operational aircraft carriers: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. Enterprise spent December and January conducting fruitless patrols, searching for an enemy that struck where American carriers were not. The frustration aboard the ship was palpable. Sailors and aviators wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese advance was so rapid and widespread that the limited American carrier forces couldn't be everywhere. The first real action came in February 1942. Admiral Chester Nimitz, now Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, ordered aggressive raids on Japanese-held islands to boost American morale and disrupt Japanese operations. Enterprise and Yorktown would strike the Marshall Islands. The operation was designated Task Force 16, with Halsey in command aboard Enterprise. On February 1, 1942, Enterprise launched strikes against Kwajalein, Wotje, and Maloelap in the Marshalls. The raids achieved complete surprise. Enterprise's Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers and SBD Dauntless dive bombers caught Japanese ships and installations unprepared. Several transport ships were sunk, aircraft destroyed on the ground, and facilities damaged. More importantly, the raids proved that American carriers could strike Japanese holdings and escape before being caught. The psychological impact was enormous. After 2 months of unrelenting defeat, America had struck back. The damage inflicted was modest, but the message was clear. The U.S. Navy was still fighting. The Japanese, meanwhile, learned an uncomfortable truth. American carriers were dangerous and aggressive. 2 weeks later, Enterprise participated in an even more audacious operation. On February 24th, working with Lexington, Enterprise launched strikes on Rabaul, the major Japanese base in New Britain. Heavy weather prevented the strikes from achieving their objectives, but again, the aggressive American posture forced the Japanese to divert resources to defense. March brought the most remarkable operation yet. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle had convinced the Army, Air Force, and Navy to launch a bomber raid on Tokyo itself. 16 B-25. Mitchell medium bombers, land-based aircraft never intended for carrier operations, would be loaded aboard the USS Hornet and launched from a point 400 miles off Japan. Enterprise would provide fighter cover for Hornet during the approach. The combined task force departed on April 2, 1942. The mission was incredibly risky. If discovered by Japanese patrol aircraft or submarines, the American carriers would face the entire combined fleet. The B-25s would have to launch from maximum range and fly to China, as they couldn't land back on the carrier. On April 18th, the task force was spotted by a Japanese picket boat 650 miles from Japan, much farther than planned. Doolittle made the immediate decision to launch early rather than risk the carriers. All 16 B-25s successfully took off from Hornet and struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was devastating. Japan's home islands had been struck. The sacred space where the emperor resided had been violated. Enterprise's role was screening the force and recovering aircraft if possible. None of the B-25s made it back, but all the Army crews knew that was the plan. The carriers escaped without detection by Japanese fleet units, and Enterprise had participated in one of the war's most daring operations. But darker days were coming. In early May, the Battle of the Coral Sea saw Lexington sunk and Yorktown damaged. Saratoga was in California undergoing repairs from torpedo damage. That left Enterprise and Hornet as the only fully operational carriers in the Pacific, and intelligence was indicating something massive was coming. The Japanese were planning a major operation, and their target was Midway Island. By late May 1942, American codebreakers had determined that the Japanese were planning an assault on Midway, a tiny atoll 2,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku was committing the entire combined fleet to the operation, including 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Japanese plan was to lure out the remaining American carriers and destroy them in a decisive battle. Admiral Nimitz knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. The Japanese had 4 carriers with experienced air groups. The U.S. had Enterprise and Hornet fully operational, plus Yorktown, hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor after Coral Sea damage. The Americans would be outnumbered in ships, aircraft, and experience. But they had one advantage. They knew where the Japanese would be and when. Enterprise departed Pearl Harbor on May 28, 1942, as flagship of Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Halsey had been hospitalized with a severe skin condition, and command passed to Spruance, a cruiser admiral with no carrier experience. It was an odd choice, but Halsey trusted him, and Spruance had a reputation for calculated tactical thinking. Task Force 16 took up position northeast of Midway on June 3rd. Yorktown's Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher joined them. The American plan was simple: locate the Japanese carriers and strike first. Everything depended on finding the enemy before being found. June 4th, 1942, dawned clear over the Pacific. At 05:34, a PBY Catalina patrol aircraft spotted the Japanese carriers 200 miles northwest of Midway. The Japanese had launched their first strike wave against Midway Island and were recovering aircraft when American land-based bombers from Midway attacked. The attacks were ineffective, but they triggered a crucial Japanese decision. Rear Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, commanding the Japanese carrier force, had held back a strike wave armed with torpedoes for anti-ship operations in case American carriers appeared. Believing no American carriers were in the area, he ordered the aircraft rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. This rearming operation would make the Japanese carriers extremely vulnerable, with ordnance scattered across the hangar decks. At 07:02, Spruance made his decision. Enterprise and Hornet would launch everything they had immediately. Yorktown, farther from the enemy, would launch 30 minutes later. It was a calculated risk. Launching at maximum range meant the American aircraft would have barely enough fuel to return. But the opportunity to catch the Japanese carriers vulnerable might not come again. Enterprise launched 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Bombing Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 6, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. In total, Enterprise put 57 aircraft in the air. Hornet launched a similar strike. Yorktown's smaller air group launched shortly after. What followed was a series of catastrophes and miracles that would decide the Pacific War. The American torpedo squadrons arrived first, flying low and slow, trying to reach launch positions. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet attacked without fighter cover and was annihilated. All 15 TBD Devastators were shot down by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in his life vest and witnessing the entire battle. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise fared little better. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led his 14 Devastators against the carrier Kaga. Japanese Zeros swarmed the slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers. 10 were shot down, including Lindsay's aircraft. Only 4 TBDs from VT-6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit was achieved by any of the 3 American torpedo squadrons. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons created an opportunity. The Japanese fighters were drawn down to sea level, chasing the torpedo bombers. The sky above was clear when Enterprise's dive bombers arrived. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding Enterprise's air group, had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, flying beyond the expected contact point, fuel running critically low. He was about to turn back when he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. McCluskey made a calculated guess. The destroyer was heading to rejoin the main force. He followed its wake. At 10:20, McCluskey spotted the Japanese carriers. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were in a loose formation, recovering aircraft. Hiryu was separated to the north. The Japanese flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Fuel lines were open. Ordnance was scattered everywhere. The carriers were, as one historian later noted, like bombs waiting for a match. McCluskey split his force, Bombing Squadron 6, 25 aircraft under Lieutenant Richard Best, would attack the nearest carrier. Scouting Squadron 6, 17 aircraft under Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, would take another. Best's bombers rolled into their dives on what he believed was a Kagi, but was actually Kaga. At the same moment, Yorktown's dive bombers were attacking Soryu from another direction. The next 6 minutes would change the war. Lieutenant Richard Best personally led 3 dive bombers against a Kagi, the Japanese flagship. Best released his 1,000-pound bomb from 1,500 feet. It struck a Kagi's flight deck near the amidships elevator. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck, where it detonated among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through a Kagi. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese carrier force was a burning wreck. Kaga was hit by 4 bombs in rapid succession. Her hangar deck became an inferno. Soryu took 3 bombs from Yorktown's bombers. All 3 Japanese carriers were fatally damaged within 5 minutes. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were dying. But the battle wasn't over. Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier, was undamaged and launched a counterattack against Yorktown. Japanese dive bombers struck Yorktown with 3 bombs, causing serious damage. Later, Japanese torpedo bombers hit her with 2 torpedoes. Yorktown, already damaged from Coral Sea, was abandoned. She would later be sunk by a Japanese submarine while under tow. The Americans still had to deal with Hiryu. Late in the afternoon, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, including aircraft displaced from Yorktown, located Hiryu. At 1700, they attacked. 4 bombs hit the Japanese carrier. Like her sisters, Hiryu was transformed into a burning hulk. By dawn on June 5th, all 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk or were sinking. Enterprise had been at the center of the most decisive naval battle in history. Her dive bombers had delivered the killing blows to 2 Japanese carriers. Her aircraft had returned, many running on fumes, some ditching in the ocean when fuel ran out. The crew had worked through the night rearming and refueling aircraft for follow-up strikes. The Battle of Midway was over. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft, and thousands of experienced aircrew. The United States had lost 1 carrier and 150 aircraft. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted in 5 minutes of coordinated dive bombing. And Enterprise, the Gray Ghost, had survived her first great battle. If Midway turned the tide, Guadalcanal was the grinding, brutal campaign that proved the United States could sustain offensive operations. The battle for this obscure island in the Solomons would last 6 months and involve some of the most savage fighting of the Pacific War. Enterprise would be at the center of it and nearly die there. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal and nearby Tulagi. The Japanese, caught by surprise, responded with fury. They sent reinforcements down the slot, the channel through the Solomon Islands, almost nightly. They launched airstrikes from Rabaul, and they committed their carriers to crushing the American invasion. Enterprise was operating as part of Task Force 61, screening the invasion force. On August 24th, Japanese scout planes located the American carriers. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons was about to begin. The Japanese committed the fleet carrier Shokaku and light carrier Zuiho, along with the repaired Zuikaku. They also sent the light carrier Ryujo as a decoy. The Japanese plan was to draw American strikes away from their main force with Ryujo, then hit the American carriers with the combined might of Shokaku and Zuikaku. Enterprise launched strikes against Ryujo, which was sunk. But then, Japanese scout planes found Enterprise. At 16:14, radar detected incoming aircraft. Minutes later, 36 Japanese dive bombers from Shokaku appeared through broken clouds. What followed was the most intense combat Enterprise had yet experienced. The carrier maneuvered violently, her helmsman throwing the big ship into radical turns that should have been impossible for a vessel her size. Anti-aircraft guns opened up, creating a curtain of fire. F-4F Wildcats from the Combat Air Patrol tore into the Japanese formations. but some bombers got through. At 16:44, a 250-kilogram bomb struck Enterprise on the flight deck aft of the number 3 elevator. The bomb penetrated 3 decks before exploding in crew berthing spaces, killing 35 men instantly. Fires erupted throughout the aft section. Seconds later, a second bomb struck near the aft elevator. This bomb also penetrated before detonating, starting more fires. A third bomb exploded on the flight deck, blowing a 10-foot hole. Enterprise was badly hurt, trailing smoke, her aft section ablaze. Damage control parties rushed to contain the fires while the carrier maintained 24 knots. Then came the critical moment. Chief Engineer Herschel A. Smith made a crucial decision. Instead of flooding the magazines, which would have saved the ship but put her out of action for months, he ordered localized flooding and aggressive firefighting. The crew responded heroically. Within an hour, the fires were under control. By 1740, less than 90 minutes after being hit, Enterprise was recovering aircraft. The Japanese pilots reported Enterprise sunk. Radio Tokyo announced her destruction. But the Gray Ghost was still fighting. She would retire to Pearl Harbor for repairs, but she'd survived her first experience with major battle damage. The crew now knew their ship could take punishment and survive. September brought even more intense action. The USS Wasp was sunk by a Japanese submarine. The USS Saratoga was torpedoed and out of action. That left Enterprise and the newly arrived Hornet as the only operational American carriers in the Pacific. The 2 carriers would have to hold the line around Guadalcanal alone. On October 26, 1942, the Japanese launched another major operation to recapture Guadalcanal. They committed 4 carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and the light carriers Junyo and Zuiho. The Battle of Santa Cruz would be one of the largest carrier battles of the war, and Enterprise would be in the center of the storm. The battle opened with both sides launching strikes. Enterprise and Hornet sent out their attack groups, while Japanese aircraft headed for the American carriers. The 2 strike packages actually passed each other in the air, both heading for the enemy. Enterprise's strike found Zuiho first, landing a bomb hit that damaged the light carrier's flight deck. Other Enterprise aircraft attacked Shokaku, scoring multiple bomb hits that would keep the Japanese carrier out of action for 9 months. But the Japanese struck back with devastating effectiveness. Hornet was hit by multiple bombs and torpedoes and left dead in the water. Enterprise, having learned from previous battles, maneuvered with incredible agility. But at 10:15, a Japanese dive bomber penetrated the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire. The 250-kilogram bomb struck the flight deck forward, penetrating to the 3rd deck before exploding. The blast killed 44 men and started serious fires. Enterprise's forward section was badly damaged, and the number 1 elevator was jammed. But again, damage control parties contained the destruction. The ship maintained speed and continued operations. Minutes later, a damaged Japanese aircraft, whether deliberately or by accident, crashed into Enterprise's flight deck near the forward elevator. Burning aviation fuel spread across the deck. More fires, more casualties. The crew fought back, hosing down fires while anti-aircraft guns continued engaging Japanese aircraft. At 11:17, another bomb hit, this one striking the flight deck near the number 2 elevator. The explosion blew out sections of the deck and started yet more fires. Enterprise had been hit 3 times in just over an hour. 44 men were dead, over 70 wounded. Her forward flight deck was a cratered ruin. Fires burned throughout the forward sections. But incredibly, unbelievably, Enterprise continued operating aircraft. The aft portion of the flight deck was still functional. Aircraft returning from strikes were directed to land on the undamaged section. Some made it, others ditched alongside, their pilots recovered by escorting destroyers. Hornet was abandoned and later sunk by Japanese destroyers. Enterprise escaped, again reported sunk by Japanese pilots, again written off by Radio Tokyo. The crew had saved their ship through extraordinary damage control and pure determination. As Enterprise withdrew toward Noumea for repairs, her crew knew they'd survived the impossible twice. The Gray Ghost legend was growing. Enterprise spent late 1942 and early 1943 in repair yards, first at Noumea, then at Pearl Harbor. The damage from Santa Cruz was extensive. Entire sections of the forward flight deck had to be rebuilt. Internal structures required repair. But by May 1943, Enterprise was back in action, her crew eager to return to the fight. The strategic situation had changed dramatically. The Marines had secured Guadalcanal. The Japanese were on the defensive throughout the Solomons. New American carriers were arriving from shipyards, Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class light carriers. The U.S. Navy was growing stronger while the Japanese struggled to replace losses in ships and, more critically, experienced aircrew. Enterprise participated in the Central Solomons campaign, striking Japanese positions on New Georgia, Kolombangara, and Bougainville. These were work operations, grinding campaigns of attrition rather than dramatic carrier battles. Enterprise's air group struck airfields, supply dumps, and shipping. The Japanese could rarely challenge the American carriers directly, their own carrier forces depleted, and their land-based air power worn down by constant combat. In November 1943, Enterprise participated in the Gilbert Islands invasion, striking Macon and Tarawa. The landings at Tarawa were particularly brutal, with Marines suffering heavy casualties fighting their way across a heavily fortified atoll. Enterprise's aircraft provided close air support, bombing Japanese bunkers and gun positions, though the effectiveness of carrier strikes against heavily fortified positions was limited. The pattern was now established for the rest of the war. Enterprise and the growing carrier force would support amphibious invasions across the Central Pacific, striking ahead of the landing forces, providing air cover, and interdicting Japanese reinforcements. It was demanding, dangerous work, though nothing compared to the desperate carrier battles of 1942. By early 1944, Enterprise was overdue for a major overhaul. She had been in continuous or near-continuous combat for over 2 years. Her machinery needed maintenance, her structure required reinforcement, and her air defenses needed upgrading. In February 1944, she entered Puget Sound Naval Shipyard for a complete reconstruction. Enterprise emerged from Puget Sound in May 1944 transformed. Her anti-aircraft armament had been massively increased. New radar systems gave her unprecedented detection capabilities. But the most significant change was her new mission: night operations. The Navy had been developing night fighting capabilities, recognizing that Japanese aircraft often attacked at dusk or dawn when visibility favored attackers. Enterprise would become the first carrier dedicated to night operations, carrying specialized night fighter squadrons equipped with radar-equipped F-6F Hellcats. The transformation required crew training in completely new procedures. Landing aircraft on a carrier deck in daylight was challenging enough. Doing it at night with minimal lighting required extraordinary skill and nerve. Enterprise's deck crews practiced for months, developing procedures that would later become standard throughout the fleet. Night Fighter Squadron 101, equipped with F-6F 5N Hellcats, mounting radar in a pod on the starboard wing, came aboard Enterprise in July 1944. The squadron's pilots had been specially trained in night operations, learning to trust their instruments and radar rather than visual cues. It was a new type of warfare, and Enterprise would pioneer it. In October 1944, Enterprise returned to combat as part of Task Force 38, the fast carrier task force under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. The target was the Philippines, where General Douglas MacArthur would fulfill his promise to return. The Japanese, recognizing the Philippines as critical to their defense perimeter, committed their remaining carrier forces in a desperate attempt to destroy the American invasion fleet. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought October 23 to 26, 1944, was the largest naval battle in history. Enterprise's night fighter squadron scored one of the battle's first victories when Lieutenant Commander John Phillips intercepted and shot down a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft during the night of October 23-24. The destruction of the scout plane potentially delayed Japanese knowledge of American carrier positions by crucial hours. During the daylight battles of October 24th, Enterprise aircraft participated in strikes against the Japanese center force under Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo, attacking the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, while aircraft from other carriers delivered most of the hits that would sink Musashi. Enterprise's bombers added to the destruction, but Enterprise's most critical role came during the night actions. On the night of October 24th, 25th, as Japanese forces maneuvered under cover of darkness, Enterprise's night fighters maintained constant patrols. They prevented Japanese reconnaissance aircraft from locating the American carriers and shot down several Japanese planes attempting night torpedo attacks. The battle culminated with the dramatic action off Samar, where escort carriers and destroyers fought desperately against Kurita's battleships and cruisers. Enterprise was too far north to participate in that action, but her aircraft struck the Japanese northern force, helping to sink the carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force. Leyte Gulf was the death of the Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Enterprise had been part of the largest naval victory in history, and her night operations capability had proven its worth. November 1944 brought a new and terrifying threat. On November 25th, a Japanese Zero fighter deliberately crashed into the escort carrier St. Lo, sinking her. The kamikazes had arrived, and they would test American carriers like nothing before. The kamikaze represented a grim calculus. A Japanese pilot with minimal training could crash into an American ship with higher probability of success than a conventional attack. The Americans had superiority in aircraft performance, pilot training, and radar-directed fighter interception. But a kamikaze only needed to get through once. The carrier force would face thousands of suicide attacks over the following months. Enterprise's night fighter capability became crucial in defending against kamikaze attacks. Many Japanese suicide aircraft approached at dawn or dusk, using low-light conditions to avoid detection. Enterprise's radar-equipped night fighters could intercept them in darkness before they reached the fleet. On November 5, 1944, Enterprise herself was targeted by a kamikaze while operating off Luzon. The Japanese aircraft, a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, penetrated the combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire. It struck the forward flight deck at Oro 658, penetrating to the gallery deck before its bomb detonated. The explosion killed 15 men and wounded 44 more. It blew a massive hole in the flight deck and started fires throughout the forward sections. For the 3rd time in the war, Enterprise had been seriously damaged by enemy action. For the 3rd time, her crew saved the ship. Damage control parties contained the fires. Repair crews fabricated steel plates to cover the hole in the deck. By 1300, just over 6 hours after being hit, Enterprise was recovering aircraft. The Gray Ghost reputation was now legend throughout both fleets. Japanese pilots claimed to have sunk her repeatedly. American sailors believed their ship was indestructible. Neither was quite right, but the combination of engineering excellence and crew determination made Enterprise extraordinarily resilient. By early 1945, the war was moving toward its inevitable conclusion. The Philippines had been liberated. Iwo Jima was taken in brutal fighting. The next target was Okinawa, only 350 miles from Japan's home islands. The Japanese would defend Okinawa with everything they had, including the largest kamikaze operations of the war. Enterprise arrived off Okinawa in March 1945 as part of Task Force 58. The invasion began on April 1st with relatively light opposition. The Japanese were holding back their main forces for the expected decisive battle. It came on April 6th. Operation Kikusui No. 1 committed 355 kamikaze aircraft and 341 conventional aircraft against the American fleet off Okinawa. Wave after wave of suicide planes attacked throughout the day, the sky filled with anti-aircraft fire and burning aircraft. Destroyers on radar picket duty took horrific casualties. Carriers maneuvered desperately to avoid attack. Enterprise's night fighters and combat air patrol destroyed numerous kamikazes before they reached the fleet. The carrier herself was not hit during the initial attacks, but the strain on the crew was enormous. General quarters was maintained for hours. Anti-aircraft crews fired until guns overheated. Fighter directors vectored interceptors constantly. The intensity of operations was unprecedented. Over the following weeks, the Japanese launched 9 more Kikusui operations, each involving hundreds of aircraft. Enterprise operated continuously, her night fighters providing crucial defense during vulnerable dawn and dusk periods. Her air group, now equipped with F-6F Hellcats and TBM Avengers, struck Japanese air bases on Kyushu, trying to destroy kamikaze aircraft before they could attack the fleet. On April 11th, Enterprise was targeted again. A kamikaze Zero penetrated the defenses and struck the carrier's flight deck. The aircraft and its bomb caused significant damage and casualties. Once again, damage control saved the ship. Once again, Enterprise was back in operation within hours. The final major damage to Enterprise came on May 14, 1945. A Zero fighter carrying a 550-pound bomb crashed into the forward elevator. The explosion was catastrophic. It blew the elevator platform 400 feet into the air. The blast tore through multiple decks. Fires erupted throughout the forward section. 13 men were killed, 68 wounded. This time, the damage was severe enough that Enterprise had to withdraw to Puget Sound for repairs. She would miss the final months of the war. On August 15, 1945, when Japan surrendered, Enterprise was still in the shipyard. The ship that had participated in nearly every major campaign of the Pacific War was not present for the victory she had done so much to achieve. But Enterprise's absence at the surrender ceremony couldn't diminish her legacy. She had earned 20 battle stars, more than any other U.S. warship in World War II. Her aircraft had sunk or heavily damaged hundreds of Japanese ships and destroyed thousands of aircraft. Her crew had saved the ship from fatal damage 5 times. She had been reported sunk by Japanese propaganda so often that American sailors joked about the gray ghost returning from the dead. The statistics tell part of the story. Enterprise participated in 18 major engagements: Pearl Harbor, Marcus Island, Wake Island, Marshall's Gilbert's raids, Doolittle Raid, Midway, Guadalcanal Tulagi, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, Rennell Island, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Truk, Saipan, Philippine Sea, Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Her aircraft flew more combat missions than any other carrier. Her crew served longer in combat than any other carrier crew. But numbers don't capture the human element. Enterprise succeeded because of her crew's extraordinary performance under impossible circumstances. Damage control parties who fought fires while under attack. Deck crews who serviced aircraft while bombs fell. Pilots who flew missions knowing their carrier might not be there when they returned. Engineers who kept machinery running beyond design limits. Cooks who fed thousands while the ship was at battle stations. Gunners who fired until their weapons glowed red hot. This was USS Enterprise CV-6, the ship that won the Pacific War.